Hey everybody, so welcome to our discussion of postmodernism. Now the first thing to say about postmodernism is that it's post-modern, and what that means is postmodernists are actively engaged in a critique of Immanuel Kant. So you can't understand postmodernism unless you have a really good handle on modernism. So here's the problem that drives all of postmodernism. I'm a scientist. I want to do science. I do my scientific experiment, my little test tube here. I find my results, I learn something new and true about the world, but once I do that, once I make my scientific observation, then I have to share it with somebody. I have to speak it. And in order to speak it, in order to share it, I have to learn language. I have to use language. Okay, so far so good. The problem is that language can't do that work. That the words I use do not necessarily correspond, in fact, almost always don't entirely correspond to what it is I've discovered using my scientific experiment. Part of the problem, as we're going to see in this next clip, is that the words themselves are simply too slippery to carry that weight.
Let's go to the cinema tonight.
You mean the movies?
There's that comedy with Sandra Bullock and that one with Robert De Niro. Which do you fancy?
I don't care.
You don't want to go then?
No, I don't care.
All right then. We won't go.
What did I do? In American, I don't care means I'm happy with either possibility. You can decide because I like both alternatives.
If we say I don't care in British English, it probably means we're apathetic. We're not interested. I don't care sounds negative.
All right, what's important about that little scene is that the same words, is the recognition that the same words can mean two completely different things. And it illustrates the problem that language always has. That language for science needs it to be precise, but in fact it can't have that precision. And so there's always a gap between what the scientist says and what the information the scientist is trying to convey. If that's true, then we cannot rely, the postmodernist says that we cannot rely on science to tell us absolute truth because it lacks the precision, because it requires language in order to tell that truth. And this creates a substantial problem that postmodernism wants to set out to identify. Not necessarily solve, but definitely identify. Modernism told us that science could always tell us the truth, and so we adopted what philosophers call this metanarrative. It's this overarching story in which science was going to save us. Science was going to tell us what the truth was. Everyone could rally around science. Everyone could understand and believe the truths that science told us. And as long as that was true, then we had a story to tell ourselves, and we could look forward to a way of understanding who we are in relationship to each other that built on that meta-narrative. Okay, here's a short illustration of how the meta-narrative works. I could have used this last week with modernism as well. Pay attention, it's a short clip, but pay attention to the way in which Picard thinks that science can solve all of our problems.
That's what all this is about. A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy.
Okay, compare that clip, especially Picard's assurance that science will tell us the truth, with this clip from The Princess Bride.
Hey, how's the city? Huh?
I think I'll leave you two pals alone.
I brought you a special present.
What is it?
Open it up.
A book?
That's right. When I was your age, television was called books. And this is a special book. It was the book my father used to read to me when I was sick, and I used to read it to your father. And today, I'm going to read it to you.
Is there any sports in it?
Are you kidding? Fencing, fighting, torture, revenge, giants, monsters, chases, escapes, true love, miracles.
Doesn't sound too bad.
The reason William Golding framed the fairy tale part of the story with the grandfather reading it to the grandson is because he wants it to be clear that we're never entirely sure what is supposed to be real here. In fact, in the book, the novel version of this, he actually acts like the fairy tale part of it is an actual fairy tale from a real country called Florin and Gilder. And what he's trying to do is just help us recognize that it's all a language game, that we're never 100% sure what is true, what is fairy tale, what is made up, what is imagination, and what isn't. And so he likes this notion that we can sort of play all between these things and never be 100% sure what's real and what isn't. That he ends the story with the grandfather saying, "As you wish," just as Wesley does to Buttercup. It's just another example of that we're always in this kind of language game, which we see in this scene, as we're about to see in this scene, when Fezzik stumbles a little bit on the word inconceivable.
You got very good arms.
He didn't fall? Inconceivable. You keep using the word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
So what happens then is that we lose our stable way of telling the truth, which means that there's no standard for truth anymore, which leads us to scenes like this one from early in President Trump's administration.
You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving, Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute, alternative facts?
And because there's no stable way of telling the truth anymore, the only way we can get truth is from what philosophers will call our tribe. In other words, we learn truth from the people that we associate with. Here are a couple of examples of how that works in American politics. I'm going to show you how politicians have reversed their position on a particular subject depending on who happens to be in power at the time.
The President of the United States says, "Stay the course." Stay the course? I don't think so, Mr. President. It's time to face the facts.
Last thing before we go here tonight, here's the headline. Lindsey Graham coming out in favor of calling witnesses during an impeachment trial.
Why do you need a witness? The whole point that we're trying to make is that in every trial that there has ever been in the Senate regarding impeachment, witnesses were called.
Oh, that explains what was going on. That was 1999 Lindsey Graham when he was impeachment manager in the Clinton impeachment. This was him tonight on Fox News.
If you want a witness, then do what Ted Cruz says. Everybody gets witnesses. If you want to turn the trial into complete circus, you're allowed to do that, but not with my vote.
What most postmoderns recognize is that our society doesn't care about truth. What it cares about is power. The question for us is not whether we're right, the question is whether we win. And so for postmoderns, the real issue, the real philosophical issue that we have to tackle is whether it's possible for us to relate to one another without it devolving into a mere search or a mere quest for power. And for most postmoderns, the answer to that question is no. So this leaves us with the question of whether Christians can use postmodernism in any meaningful way. And for many theologians, especially some contemporary ones, the answer is actually yes, that postmodernism provides an opportunity for us to rethink both our relationship to Kant and modernism, but also our understanding of what it means to inhabit the Christian community in the ways in which we are formed by our life within the community, including worship, which is exactly what a really good theologian named James K.A. Smith is talking about in this clip.
Christian worship is a kind of imagination station, right? And what's happening is by being, called again and again back into God's story around word and table is, on the one hand, I'm learning all kinds of things explicitly, but I'm actually also absorbing a gospel sensibility at the level of the imagination. I'm learning to imagine the world differently, and sometimes I won't even be able to put that into words. And yet what's happening is I am becoming a character in a different story.
So where does all of this leave us? Well, I can think of three things. One is that postmodernism provides a really helpful critique of Kant, and from a philosophical perspective, it's worth paying attention to just on that level. Secondly, I think postmodernism is really useful in the ways in which it analyzes our culture. If you want to understand why Fox News and MSNBC exist, postmodernism can really help because it helps us understand how tribalism works and the search for power works. But most of all, I think postmodernism provides us with an opportunity to look forward to what's next. I saw that sort of coming out of the Smith piece we just watched, but also I want us to think about it in those terms too. Postmodernism isn't enough from a theological perspective. There has to be more. There has to be a meta-narrative that works. So our task as theologians is to figure out what meta-narrative and how can we articulate it in a way that makes sense to our world after Kant.